whoa, I see some numbers climbing here, so that's great. Welcome, everyone. So this is the Latham Lecture Series on What Should We Make, a conversation about futuring. And I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm Laura Forlano. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology and director of the Critical Futures Lab. And this is the last event in our 2021 Latham Lecture Series. And I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about ID and the Latham Series as a background to this conversation. So as many of you might know, the Institute of Design is known for pioneering human-centered design and systems design. We were the first to introduce the PhD program in design in the United States, but we're actually more than a graduate school. We're an institute and an international community of learners and practitioners focused on building the future with both principle and purpose. And this series is named after Richard Latham, who studied design at IIT in the 1940s and asked the question, is all this design necessary, or literally are all these things necessary? Had we not pursued the planning philosophy, I probably wouldn't be asking myself these kinds of questions, but rather concentrating on the next client and all the things that we should design, whether the world needs them or not. And that's an original quote from Richard Latham. So I think it aligns really nicely with the conversation that we're going to have today. So I'm actually really thrilled to be here with Marina Gorbis from the Institute of the Future, Kenneth Bailey from Design Studio for Social Intervention, Mushon Zer-Aviv from Shual.com, and the Shenkar School of Engineering and Design. And to start our conversation today, I wanted to ask the question, about whether each of you could introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your work, and give an example of what you mean by futuring, how you use it, why we need it, giving us something tangible to sort of understand your work through to set the conversation in this direction for the next hour. So thank you very much. Let's perhaps start with Marina.
Sure. Thank you so much, and great to be here, Laura, and my co-panelist. I'm Marina Gorbis. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for the Future. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we were formed in 1968. So we've been around for 53 years. We're probably the longest living futures organization as far as we know, which with it brings a lot of humility, because there's a lot of stuff we can go back to and look at our forecast and what we've done. And really the way I kind of think about the future and the way we define what we do is really, it's about systematically thinking about key drivers of the past, present, and future, and ultimately working with these drivers to imagine and think about possibilities that are helping people make better decisions today. And of course, what that means may mean different things for different people and groups, but for us, it's really designing for equity, designing for inclusion, designing for sustainability, all these things that we are really committed to. Over the years, we've built lots of different sort of techniques and ways of thinking about the future and understanding. The couple of things I want to emphasize in our work, it's very much about systems approach. So it's looking at the connections between different areas and connecting the dots to understand the fuller picture. And in some ways, to me, future thinking is really also about understanding the present. How did we get here? So in our work, we always start with understanding historically. The present that we live is a result of choices that we've made decades ago. So understanding how we got to those choices, why, what were they, is really essential before you even start thinking about the future and where this is possible. I guess one recent example and something that we continue to work on is my specific work. I've been at the Institute for over 20 years now. So I've probably worked on projects on the future of pretty much everything, although you can never say that. But a lot of my work has been really focused on what's happening with work and organization of labor, particularly started with emergence of different platforms like Uber and other kinds of platforms that connect people to get things done. And so we were really interested in why this is happening. And obviously, it hasn't been really beneficial for labor. And in many ways, it's sort of really exacerbating some of the income and wealth inequalities that exist. And more people are kind of moved into those positions of independent gig, which by itself is not a really negative thing, but it's particularly negative in the US context. So if all of your benefits and assets are tied to employment, to formal employment, then you're really at a disadvantage. So we started the project that we started probably 5 more years ago was how do you create positive platforms? So if you think about the kind of organizations we create, technology is a piece of it, but that's just one piece of it. It's really shaped by government policy, regulatory environment, social setting, the cultural attitudes, all of these things, right? Labor availability and all these other things. So it's partially a design. Designers make choices when they build these platforms. And early on, we realized that these choices are really important. They're not just choices in terms of consumers, right? You being able to access an app very easily and order a cab or whatever you want to order online. And that's what all of these apps and platforms are designed in mind with, right? It's a consumer, but actually they're becoming gates to people getting jobs. They're becoming sort of distributors of labor. They are becoming payment systems for labor. So it's much more than just a consumer app. It's a means of sustaining livelihoods for millions and millions of people. So designers in this particular environment, and probably in others, they bear a huge responsibility for this social impacts of what they're designing. So we had series of design sort of charrettes and brought people together to think about what would the positive platform look like, both from the designer perspective, what can you design into the technology itself and the platform, but what is the design at the policy level, because you can't accomplish everything. And the way the platforms have evolved and design choices, they evolve very differently in Europe, for example, because of very different labor regulations of technology and other things. So it's not something that's just about the design. Design sits in the larger system of this kind of social system, socio-technical regulatory system. So we did a series of charrettes and thinking using futures tools and future design tools to really think about what would a positive platform look like, and came out with a manifesto around sort of 10 sort of interventions that could produce more positive outcomes for workers, right? And these interventions were at the level of design, what can be sort of built into the design of platforms themselves, but also what are the policy interventions that are needed? For example, how do you maximize incomes on these platforms? There are design things that you can do, right? But there are also policy things. For example, can you establish minimum wage or livable wage on platforms? What about transparency and privacy? Can workers also see their reputations and how they're created? Can you make those portable? Can you include, that's one thing, but on the government side, because particularly in the US, people who do not have work in formal organizations do not have access to benefits. Do you create portable benefits? What are the other ways? Do you create some kind of funds for workers who participate? Or is it a larger redesign of the whole social safety net in the US in particular? So that started probably 5-6 years ago. But where it's taken us is really, and this is the work we're doing now, and Kenny is involved, is really thinking we're going through a major transformation, we think, in the nature of work and organization of labor. And the kind of organizations we created in the last 100 years, which is corporate organizations, were a product of that era. And now we're moving into something else. You can't put these technologies in the box, back in the box, but you can shape them. Technology do exist in the social organization. So our big question now is, how do you design equitable enterprise? So we just launched this project called Equitable Enterprise. Kenny is one of our advisors. And really looking at what are the forms of enterprise that basically more equitably distribute assets, key resources, not just to investors, but also to people who participate in creation of that value. So we just launched it literally this month. We're doing series of deep dives and exploring everything from public trust to community trust to co-ops to platform co-ops, all these different things. So just one example.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina. And then Kenny, wonder if you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about one of your projects.
You got it. I had to unmute myself. Hello, everyone. My name's Kenneth Bailey. I'm currently in Boston. I'm one of the co-founders of the Design Studio for Social Intervention. We've been around for about 15 years. We really started to help people in the social change sector imagine new ways to solve social problems, to be more inventive and creative in how they conceive of problems and the kinds of things they do to interfere or intervene in them. We recently wrote a book called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects. I'm going to put a link to an excerpt from it that was published by Nonprofit Quarterly in the chat. Please check that out. It's our take on systems design and social justice. And I want to say that how we're thinking about this question, what should we make, and how we're thinking about the future is we're really interested in making new platforms for new, more equitable social relations. We're really interested in creating the opportunities for people who are living in social conditions to have the opportunities to actually step out and be part of the design of the kinds of social conditions and social lives they really are interested in living. It's to refer back to Marina's work on equitable enterprise. One of the things we've been saying a lot about these questions about the future of work are really questions about the future of social life, are really questions about how do we arrange social life such that how do we use these sort of breakdowns between the old kind of agreements that were in place having to do with work being the primary way in which we make life happen for our families, and that we use the money from work to pay for food, and that we use the food to feed our particular families. That whole assembly of agreements, which we refer to as social arrangements, we see are kind of coming apart. They're unraveling. And so for us, we see this as an opportunity in terms of futuring to begin to start to propose maybe a more just, a more sustainable, a more convivial set of social arrangements that might make life more interesting and more fun. With that in mind, I'm going to share my screen and show you one of the projects that we've been working on. Let me do this here. Wait a minute. Close this, open this. Now go to share. And then click on that, share. And then go to slideshow. So one of our sort of classic design, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. One of our classic design research projects that we have been doing in the United States and in other parts of the world is called Public Kitchen. And in this project, we pose the question, if kitchens were public and ubiquitous in social life, the ways in which we have come to know schools, public transportation, libraries as public infrastructure, if we had kitchens that were public in our lives, how could they potentially change the ways in which we live together? How could they change the quality of social life? When we pose this question, we pose it in and with communities. So this project was started in collaboration with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, Upham's Corner Main Streets in Boston, and another set of grassroots organizing organizations to ask residents of the Upham's Corner community, if they had a public kitchen, what would it concretely do to how they live together? So people said things like, God, I could see that really decreasing how much money I spend on food, or I would come and eat rice because I love rice and I can't cook it, or I would come hang out, or I would want to start a business there. And from that, starting to say what things could be possible, the next step we did was have people start to rehearse those things. Like, if you could do that, what would it look like? And to start to step into embodying and living in that imagination, in that future that we were really proposing. And so I think one of the ways we really get at futuring is through proposing these kinds of new social propositions, and then letting people live into them, and then start to play out how that would then change the nature of sociality and the places where they are. What we're trying to do now with this kind of work is to move from, when we learn about projects like Public Kitchen, where let me just show you some other pictures. I would show you a video, but we don't have that much time. Here are some pictures of people participating in Public Kitchen from that initial project in Upham's Corner in Boston and Dorchester in the United States. And what we are interested in doing is, when we find projects like this where communities really are like, oh yeah, we would love to have that infrastructure and let's make it happen, how do we then use the embodied proposition from there and go up to change policy and regulatory frameworks? Because if public kitchens existed, the policy and regulatory frameworks that currently exist would squash them. And so what we have to do is then get people to embody what they want, and then advocate the opposite way to change the policies and the regulatory regimes out of which to make these kinds of realities happen. But people, what we find is that people aren't interested in policy and regulatory regimes if they don't have an embodied way to make changing them make sense. And so we see these kinds of strategies as the concrete way, the embodied way, the personal way to get people invested in the rules and regimes that actually shape and conform the qualities of their life. But you gotta start with the qualities of life first. And I think I'm gonna stop there, and we can continue to talk. I have so much stuff to say and I don't know when to stop, so I'm just gonna stop.
I love this example, Kenny. Yeah, it's great, and lots of things to discuss. Mushon, could you introduce yourself and offer an example of your work?
Sure. So thanks. I already have so much to say about what you two already said. Yeah. So a bit about me. So I'm coming to you today from Tel Aviv, and that's a part of the context, because after 5 years in New York between 2005 and 2010, I moved back to Tel Aviv with a certain expectation about, or lack of expectation about the future, and I was and I am very involved in politics of technology and politics of data and design, and with the kind of trouble that my corner of the world is known for, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And at some point I felt like, especially with the kind of present that we have here, that it's really hard for me to imagine the future, and specifically around all of the uncertainties of the region are focused around one city, which is Jerusalem. And I was invited to do a project in Jerusalem, and I teamed with another designer, Shalev Moran, to do a project called Speculative Tourism, where we invited different authors from different contexts and different politics and gender and race and ethnicity and so on, to imagine futures for the city. And you have to understand that Jerusalem, everybody knows that Jerusalem is a very historic city. So Jerusalem is completely embedded in its past. It's constantly living its past. It's really contested when it comes to its present, and it's completely terrified from its future on very, very different levels. So when we worked with the authors, we tried to use tools from strategic foresight and futuring, and things that are studied in future studies, and tools from science fiction, and specifically the tool that we were using a lot is backcasting. The idea that you first mark a certain future and then try to create a history for that future, and by that kind of create a narrative scenario that would ground that future in some kind of concept of change. And the results of that of these tours, basically the format was audio tours. So the authors ended up writing audio tours of specific locations in Jerusalem in different futures, and they had to also kind of take into account this plurality of futures through that project. And we've continued with this project since, and I've kind of deepened my thoughts about futures. And then at some point I was invited to do a similar process for policy rather than for art. So I was invited to lead a set of workshops around smart mobility in Israel. So Marina, you mentioned Uber. So Uber is not yet in Tel Aviv or in Israel in general, because of a strong lobby of the taxi drivers. A lot of libertarians are very pissed about that. I definitely see the value. And in general, while Israel is developing a lot of technologies for smart mobility and urban tech and a lot of these kinds of technologies, it was not the agenda here was not yet set by corporate interests. So there was an opportunity to intervene in advance with policy towards futures. And what we did there is we used the tools. We used some of the same tools that we used with the authors. And specifically, what was specifically interesting is that we took the backcasting methodology and we added another element to that, which we call friction mapping. So the idea is that whatever future we imagine, be it a very desirable future or a very undesirable future, it would not happen without conflict and without friction. And if this is a desirable future, that we need to understand what will we be up against to get to that future. And we need to understand that friction in the closer future to be able to start dealing with that today. And if we're trying to speak about less desirable elements of the future and frictions that might prevent them to happen or slow them down, we need to become that friction. So the idea is to use friction within the process of anticipation. And that really created, like, all of a sudden from a very kind of abstract or very imaginative process of futuring, there was an agenda. Like there were a set of things to do tomorrow morning, which is what I see futuring for. Like, and since that project, I worked on a couple of other speculative policy workshops or anticipatory workshops around the diasporic identities of Jewish identities in Europe. AI and creative practice. I'm working on a new one around the affordances of rivers in a changing climate. I am starting to work on an anticipatory workshop around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and one that is and another one that is trying to investigate this concept of post-COVID. And I'm saying post-COVID because I don't think it means what we used to think it would mean. Before we started this conversation, I mentioned that we used to speak about the weather in small talk, and then we started to speak about COVID statistics. And now we're trying to get back to speak about the weather. But I think what we really need to do, we really need to get back to speak about the weather, but in a completely different way. Like we need to understand COVID as what I'm trying to label as global friction, a unique global friction event, in one that never happened before, one that manages to get all of our lives, including our small talk, to all be filtered through the question of COVID. And basically, we were supposed to be in that position about climate change for so much time at this point, and we need to get back to talk about the weather, but in a different way. So this is kind of a bit of a context of the main project that I'm focused on now, which is a book about that starts from design concepts of friction and flow, to try to kind of propose a design theory of change that is very much focused on how design structures flow from the very kind of minute and kind of nuanced elements of typography or hierarchy of buttons in an interface, to the level of anticipation and thinking about futures. And if I have another second, I would love to show one slide. Laura, okay, is that an option?
Sure.
So I'll share my screen. So this is a preview to something I'm going to talk about in a conference next week in Berlin at the World Future Studies Foundation's conference. So let's see. Do you see my screen?
Yep.
So I want to. My background is in graphic design, and my focus has been in data visualization, and I want to reflect on how we talk about things that we can't see. And with both the pandemic and climate change, we don't see that with our eyes. We don't experience these global frictions with our eyes. Now, when in the spring of 2020, the image that led our imagination of the pandemic was this, right? The flattening the curve. Now, flattening the curve is a graph that is supposed to communicate the fact that we need to work on these peaks, right? Like we need to make sure that the peak of the peak doesn't overwhelm the health system. So the comparison is supposed to be between the peaks of that graph, but I think that's not how the way we saw it. What we saw was the end of the curve, this one. What this graph actually promised us is that this is going to pass. Whatever that is, we are going to deal with that, and then it would be over. We will get our lives back. That was kind of a promise of resilience, right? We will get back to normal. We will get back to before COVID. That's the promise of post-COVID. Now, with climate change, the graphic that we have is this, right? The rising temperature, and when we try to think, what are we fighting for? It's all different versions of what? Of extinction. So do we want like total extinction or near total extinction? Or like, I think there's something completely depressing and something that we cannot really sign up for when this is how we imagine this thing that we can't see. Literally, there's nothing to look up for, nothing to look forward for. And maybe the biggest challenge that we have right now is to not only imagine the future of climate change through the perspective of prediction of the temperature rise, but to really imagine our lives in a way that is not only like something that I can relate to, but maybe something that I can imagine being, inspiring, maybe even something to look up for. And there
Great.
are.
Thank you, Mushon. I think it's a great time it's a great provocation, and it's a great time to move to the discussion, because we have a pretty ambitious set of questions that we wanted to take some time to exchange across all of the presentations and examples in particular. So I think we heard three, very interesting projects that engage with futuring. But keep in mind that a lot of people who've joined us today are very new to futures and futuring. So we heard about the Positive Platforms Project, the Public Kitchen Project, and the Speculative Tourism Project, and each of them engages in their own way across, these more analytical and sort of types of futuring, which are tied to things like foresight and more planning oriented. And then another side of it, which is really this imaginative and expansive and generative and creative and experiential. And I think in each of your practices, you have to somehow do both of those at various times. So I wondered if we could answer the question of, why has futuring become so exciting right now in this moment? During COVID, there have been tons of webinars and things about futuring. So why do we think that is? And then how do you navigate that tension between planning and improvisation in these methodologies? And now it'll be more of a free flow conversation. So feel free to jump in when you have, when you want to respond.
Marina, that's totally you. You should do that one.
Oh, me? Okay. Definitely a lot of interest in futures. All of a sudden, just everybody is developing scenarios, post-COVID scenarios. There's been lots of that. I think there are several things. Obviously, I think it's a bane of being a futurist that every day you wake up and you go, oh my gosh, that was our scenario from 10 years ago. Remember the Superstruck game that we created, which basically had 4 scenarios. One of them was called ARDS, Acute Respiratory Distress Syndrome. And we asked the community to participate and live and simulate what would you do. And it's eerie actually to go back to that. It was something Jane McGonigal created. So there's definitely a lot of interest. I think partially it feels like that moment where because we've been in lockdown, because of climate, because of so many things, the political environment, I think we're in a period of rethinking, and it's almost like we're looking in the mirror, and the mirror is showing us something different. We are really reevaluating everything that our core beliefs about work, about society, about information, about science, everything is kind of up in arms, right? It's like, okay, so, but we haven't yet converged on, well, what is desirable? But people are looking for that, and they're looking for, well, and this is where the futures is important. To me, the futures is as much about the past as it is about the present and the future. And the reason the past is important is because we tend to think when in this work that the way everything is preordained, like the way we work, the corporate structures, the politics, it's preordained because that's what we've experienced during our lifetime. But if you go back in history, people have organized and lived in very, very different ways, right? And work wasn't organized. The whole concept of wage labor is a fairly recent experience. It doesn't mean that people were sitting around doing nothing. They were creating, they were doing things, but so actually history gives us kind of fodder for imagination to say, hey, it is changeable, and there's something we've done before that was different. So that's really important. And then the other thing is we're seeing in this time people organizing and doing things differently. So people disconnecting from work, like nap ministry, people deciding the nap or rest is a form of resistance, right? Or really, or doing all kinds of other things, working in very different ways. So there are signals, this is what we call signals. There are signals of what people are doing today that are kind of on the margins maybe, or they look crazy or different, but they're important for us to understand because that's signal of something that may become our future. So in futures work, it's really a combination of the past and the signals of the future and putting it all together in a systemic way. And is it about planning or is it about imagination? I think it's kind of both, right? It's like imagination is really essential in futures work because future only exists in our imagination in many ways, right? There are no facts about the future. We have facts about history, sort of. There are oftentimes contested facts, but there is some data, but there are no data about the future. So you have to engage in your imagination in really thinking what is desirable, but then you do have to plan, right? And some of these negative scenarios are particularly important to explore because we need to be prepared also. Obviously, what we're experiencing now is a result of lack of that kind of foresight and preparation, or the gap between the foresight and what was known and the ability to act and prepare. So I think it's both.
How do we deal with, I think, this new moment where we have this sort of opportunity where people are interested in rethinking social order, but we haven't necessarily, that's new. The participatory aspect of not just stepping out of certain kinds of social orders into new ones, this idea of having people be part of shaping new social orders, don't we think that that's pretty new? And what do we do with this opportunity, like the kinds that I'm proposing? Like, I'm interested in, horizontal participation in the next set of social agreements we make about life, about work, about naps, for example. What's the future of that? You all do we think is that going to be something we see being taken up globally? I don't know. I'm asking the question for our own sake.
You're getting into the issue of power, right? Like, because power is a big part of this conversation. And then what it kind of brings up for me is, what power do we have? Like disconnecting and striking, that's a form of power, right? Opting out is a form of power. That's one kind of power. Can you do it on a massive scale? how do you motivate people to do it? I mean, there's been times where people have done that. The Black Lives Matter movement was that moment, right? Like, and it did change things. Occupy was that moment, and it changed the conversation. So I think opting out and coming together is one way. I think policy is definitely the pressure, political pressure, which is very difficult right now. But I think the other side is, you know, we've lived in a set of beliefs that are very, very deeply embedded. And I think it goes back to, like, I mean, neoliberalism is a concept going back to 1950s. And we need to move to, and it's been very, very powerful. We're still living that, right? So it took 30 years between the early think tanks writing about all of these, winning Nobel Prize in economics, and the Reagan Revolution. And then it's, okay, maybe it's a 30-year project that we're on, because we need more of that. We need more of these. These beliefs are so deeply embedded, like what you're doing, Kenny, the public kitchen, that goes against everything, because, you know, I mean, it's an antidote. I do believe that it's right, because we've been taught that private sector does everything better. You know, it's more efficient, it's more productive. And here you're creating a public infrastructure of kitchens. What a revolutionary idea. But, you know, maybe it takes those kind of prototypes in a few more places, and people start saying, hey, this is something great. I want to support this.
So I really love Public Kitchen as well. I didn't know this project before, and Marina, you mentioned resistance and protest, and like and how Occupy changed the conversation. I think we need at this point to change more than the conversation, and I think projects like Public Kitchen they're doing something different in the way that it's more than a protest, it's a demonstration. It's a demonstration in the prototyping sense. And I think the next step after demonstration would be to then say, okay, we've just demonstrated a possible future. Like, what if this is not, you know, not a provocation, but a present? What needs to happen for that? Like, how can we turn ideas that are more kind of out there, and what Laura mentioned earlier, like examples from art, and then really build strategy. Like, and I think as designers, we hold both ends. Like, we can do both the speculative provocations and the strategy, and that's, I think that's the mission. That's what we should make.
I agree. I think, like, these prototypes that are visible, and the more they're visible to more people, the more they become. I think a lot of things that people are voting against, or it's because they have no experience. Like, we don't have an experience of a public healthcare system that works, or actually private healthcare system that works too. We have very little experience of education being a right rather than a commodity, right? So all of these things, but there are places where it is a right, you know, in a lot of European countries, and you actually get a stipend to go to college because it's considered a public good. You know, we have lots of examples. So how do you, I think this is the moment to create these demonstrations and prototypes of various kinds of things, but it's very much against the current, you know, where capital flows and all the other forces. So it is a form of resistance.
And even our habits and practices of body and mind, you know, like I even think about in our own practice, like, how do I galvanize the people who are on our side, for example, to even help us get the next set of iterations out? It's like you're always already, like, to try to move towards more robust, more just, more interesting, in my mind, futures. you're always going up against the epistemology of the present. You're always going up against the ways in which our minds are organized currently.
Yeah.
Such a great discussion. And when the public kitchens example, it reminds me actually of the early days of community-owned wireless networks, which were illegal in Indonesia. And due to the demonstration projects, done in the community, they eventually became legal. But then it brings up the question for me is that, isn't this the same strategy that Silicon Valley uses? For example, companies are constantly making things that sort of get around existing regulations, and then we have a really hard time reining it in. So it just strikes me that as a methodology, are we recommending, essentially the same kind of thing, this kind of demonstration or prototype, or even what we might even think of like as these test beds, right? And then what are the sort of the politics of our test beds, of course, are going to be different than those that are being proposed by the Facebooks and Ubers and of the world.
Yeah, but they have been successful, right? They go into these places boldly. The problem is that projects like Kenny's probably doesn't have as much capital invested in it, right? So you can't create 100.
I think we can say definitely don't.
Yeah, and try selling that project and an investment in that and scale it at that level, right? I mean, Uber's innovation is really a regulatory innovation, right? The money that they raise is basically goes to lobbying all the local governments to basically allow them to operate, right? So I think that reality is that this is where a lot of public nonprofit work happens, is you can't get access to capital, sufficient capital, so you're kind of hacking your way into, where's the spaces I can do this, and can I get this little amount of money? Imagine if Kenny had this kind of money that was pumped into Facebook, and we would have public kitchens in every city.
We could
Who would do that?
We could even take 1/10 of it.
Yeah, you probably don't even need hundreds. Yeah. But this is where, but it is a compelling, we're just using public kitchens. There's probably 10 other places that you can kind of create public spaces. In San Francisco, we had Free Space, where they basically took over a building and collectively created into a community space, right? There are a lot of abandoned buildings. There are now abandoned malls. There are a lot of spaces. We have an abundance of a lot of things. It's just, if we could really collectively do something, and with a little bit of money, that would be amazing.
But I think I agree that finance is in a way, at least how we set, we can imagine the differences of power, and I'm not claiming that they don't exist. I'm just saying that a part of a futuring process for public kitchens would be also to anticipate other changes that would make public kitchens more feasible, and not only anticipate, not only imagine the conditions that might support that, to also understand that these are the kind of this is the near-term friction that we need to work on, and the fact that we can already demonstrate and experience a future that is desirable is a powerful catalyzer towards action that was not necessarily in our immediate agenda, mainly because we imagine the balances of power as something that doesn't allow us even to consider an option like this.
I think with that, we're going to move to a Q&A and field some of the questions that you all have brought to us. And Kristen has joined us to help us select some of those questions and bring those forth for our discussion.
Perfect. So we have one question in the Q&A so far. Please feel free to drop some more in there. We also have some questions that already came in from registrants before the session started that we'll turn to. So our first question here is asking about, I think it's a question about stakeholders. So how do you involve subjects within physical environments like rivers, mountains, oceans, protected animal species as stakeholders in building a future, specifically in the context of ensuring that we address environmental justice and climate concerns in the futures that we are moving toward?
It sounds like this question is about specifically the non-human as stakeholder. Is that fair to say?
I think so.
Yeah, I love that. There's been a lot of really interesting socially engaged art that's really done a lot of work. I would recommend looking at Marina Zerko's work. She does a lot of work around thinking species being and the non-human, particularly around climate and climate crisis. But that's not the answer. The answer that is that I think, well, an answer is through art. An answer is we engage the non-human, we engage other kinds of intelligent forms of life through forms of art and imagination, like the work that Marina's doing. And I could think of some others, but my mind just went blank. So I'm going to turn it over to anyone else who wants to answer.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree that that art is key for that, but I think it's not enough. So I think maybe the more challenging question is not, because in a lot of cases the artwork would work as a proposal to include other species as stakeholders, that actually serves as a provocation to remind us that we're not doing that, right? And then we say, okay, we're not doing that, and the art shows us, and we kind of, I'm exaggerating, and kind of, but we kind of feel bad about ourselves because we're not including, non-humans, and that's pretty much where it ends. We actually need to then, and I think that this is exactly on us, to transform from the provocation to the strategy. And then we need to create alliances between humans and non-humans, because we're still, we're not communicating really well with the non-humans. And we need to create languages that we would create these bridges, and that's really hard. It's also slightly less exciting than an artistic provocation, and I love Marina's work.
Yeah, and I think art is.
Please don't mute yourself when you're laughing. Please don't.
I think art is important, but I think what, Mushon, you're bringing up is that there is a policy also arena, and there are places that have given citizenship rights to rivers and forests, and that's very concrete. That makes a huge difference when
and corporations, by the way.
Yeah, when you totally change the playing field.
So we had a number of questions that sort of connect to this idea of like, how do we build, how do we reconcile this tension between a preferred future and a plausible future? And I think this is connected to other questions that we've received about bringing this kind of futuring that you've been talking about today to a business or a corporate situation, and making decisions about making responsible decisions about what to make.
So I think there's an avenue that is building up into business schools and into business language, and I think a lot of the work the Institute for the Future has been doing has been setting some foundations there, and I'm sure Marina can talk about that. But strategy, that word strategy, is something that business talks about all the time. and the kind of uncertainties that we're talking about as options for change are what business in a lot of cases talk about as as uncertainties that threaten businesses, or optionally are things to capitalize on. So there are possible bridges in language that I think we need to cross, and we need to you know, I think Laura mentioned how Silicon Valley uses these kind of prototyping and kind of fail fast, fail often, and disruption and creative disruption and so on. I don't see that as necessarily something that would not validate the tools. I think this is actually an opportunity for us to interject power, right? To say, oh, we can talk this talk, and we can offer something here that would not leave us in the role of the provocators, but give us, you know, an opportunity to affect power.
So we have another question in the Q&A here that I think does get to kind of the root here of some of the tensions that that we want to confront as we're constructing futures, and that is that people have different ideas about what a positive future is, first of all, and that there are these tensions between corporate interests and activist dreams, as we put it in the original event description. So just wonder, do you have any of you examples of how you've dealt with this tension, or how you've reconciled these conflicting interests?
Yeah, and it's a really hard question to answer, because I do think that bringing business futures to any discipline, but including the business school, is great. But if you're using futures work to say, okay, how can I sell more of this product that's harmful to the somebody's health, which, you know, increases my shareholder profits, and a lot of futures work has been used in corporate settings a lot, right? That's mainly where it's part of strategy work, it's part of visioning work. So I'm not sure that bringing futures work to the traditional business schools is, I mean, I do think that a good futures work will open up people's possibilities and bring up those tensions and dilemmas that are needed. But I do think that where futures work is needed now is actually in communities that have been really excluded from imagining and giving the tools for really shaping the future. Who is in the conversation about the future? And a lot of futures work has been in the conversations about products and services and within existing structures, right? And I think the good futures work really questions the larger structure in which it exists. And for some companies, it is a conversation, and you can't have this conversation. And definitely people in those organizations are open to them. But it's a difficult one because you're operating within the constraints. But I think if you're a good designer in futures, you do come in and question the system, at least open up that conversation.
I think there's also the point. It's two sides, right? So as Marina said, like the corporate settings have been strategizing and futuring for a very long time. It's the public that needs to do the catching up, and I think a huge role of creative professions and kind of civic-minded creatives is to understand that it's not only our role to imagine, it's our role to share these tools for imagination. So In future studies, there's a lot of discussion about futures literacy and specifically a term that I really like, anticipatory skills or anticipatory properties. So anticipation is something that we do in the present, right? And not only us, by the way, if we talk about the non-human, anticipation is not a human, exclusively human thing. It's many systems anticipate. We need to understand that a part of what makes a lot of this conversation asymmetrical is not only capital, it's also anticipatory skills. And if we have better anticipatory skills when we discuss, for example, Uber, and apparently taxi drivers in Israel did have enough anticipatory skills to say, no way, then we can act in time. And I'll try, he was mentioned in passing, but I'll quote Milton Friedman, who said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So they are, and the ideas that he had, of course, are, unfettered capitalism and like draconian neoliberal policies. But the ideas lying around, if these are the ideas lying around, that would be the result of change.
I think we have to close now, but I love that we can kind of close on that quote and think about how it might impact our thinking going forward in different ways than perhaps intended. So I thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for all of you who have joined us throughout the Latham series this year. And I wish we had time to answer every question, but as Laura indicated, we'll be talking with each of the folks here on the podcast in the coming months. So please stay tuned for that. And thanks again for joining us.
Yes, thank you all. Just to echo that, it's just been such an honor to spend this time with you today and have this, my dream conversation on futures, really, as part of the Latham series. So thanks again, and we look forward to staying in touch and continuing the conversation with our guests and also with everyone who attended today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's stay in touch.